Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're embarking on a journey to understand ourselves, maybe others too, a little better. We're looking through the lens of the Enneagram. Think of it like a map, maybe. It's got 9 distinct points, or territories, each showing a really fundamental way we experience the world and how we relate to ourselves and others.
And what's fascinating, I think, is where it comes from. You see elements in modern psychology, sure, but also these deep echoes in ancient spiritual wisdom.
Yeah, like you find threads in Christian contemplative practices, Buddhist thought, Sufi mysticism, even Jewish Kabbalah.
Exactly. And the core idea that sort of ties these together with the Enneagram is this. We're essentially spiritual beings living in a material world. We're inherently connected to something. Well, let's call it a divine spirit.
Okay.
But, life happens, experiences, our own defenses. They create this kind of fog almost. It obscures that inner light, that connection.
And the Enneagram helps us see through that fog.
Precisely.
Yeah.
It helps identify what creates the fog for each of us, the specific patterns that keep us from remembering that true connected nature we have.
Right. So it's not about slapping a label on you and saying, okay, you're this. It's more like holding up a mirror.
Yeah, a mirror to see the patterns you've already got going on, the box you've perhaps unknowingly stepped into.
But crucially, it also shows you the way out of the box. It offers clues for moving towards, greater freedom, more authenticity. So our mission in this deep dive is really to explore how the Enneagram can be a valuable tool specifically for Christian growth.
Right.
And today we're narrowing our focus onto type 8. They're often called the challenger.
And within that focus on type 8, we'll be digging into how understanding their inner world, their motivations, can actually be a powerful aid in managing anger.
Okay.
We'll also look at what it means for any type to move towards integration or disintegration. Those are key Enneagram concepts. And we'll touch on how past experiences might shape an 8, what tends to trigger them, especially in conflict, and ultimately the specific paths for growth available to type 8s.
Okay, great. So let's dive deeper then into this connection you mentioned between the Enneagram and Christian growth. You said it draws on this universal wisdom.
It really does, and it resonates quite strongly with core Christian concepts. Think about those really powerful spiritual metaphors we hear: grace, liberation, being born again, awakening from illusion.
Yeah, those big ideas.
Well, the Enneagram gives us a surprisingly practical framework for understanding what actually gets in the way of experiencing those very things in our lives.
Oh, so?
It provides really specific insights into our psychological makeup, but also our spiritual makeup. It helps us see the ingrained patterns that act like blinders, really. They prevent us from fully grasping our deep spiritual nature and that inherent connection to the divine.
So it's not just like abstract theology. It's a tool for inner work.
Exactly. It gives a direction, a kind of roadmap for that inner journey. But, and this is crucial, something our sources really stress. The Enneagram describes the ways we've limited ourselves, the coping mechanisms we've built.
Ah, so it's not describing who we fundamentally are in God's eyes.
Precisely. We can think about it in terms of essence and personality. Essence is, you could say, that divine spark within us, our true spiritual nature.
Okay.
Personality, on the other hand, that's what develops over time. It's how we learn to navigate the world, try to get our needs met, especially when we're young.
Right, the coping strategies.
Yeah. And as we use the Enneagram to become more aware of our personality's patterns, those patterns start to become more transparent, less solid.
And that allows...
It allows us to experience our essence more directly. That connection with divinity feels more real, more accessible.
Okay, and this links into the basic fear for each type, doesn't it? Where does that come from?
Our sources suggest it arises from that early feeling, often subconscious, of disconnection from our essential nature. Even in really good homes, childhood developmental needs aren't always met perfectly. That can lead to these fundamental anxieties taking root.
And the basic desire is trying to fix that fear.
Essentially, yes. It's the ego strategy. The personality develops this desire as its way of trying to feel safe or maybe just okay again in the face of that underlying fear.
So the ego has its own kind of agenda.
You could say that. It's constantly chasing something it believes will fill that void left by the disconnection from essence. Now, these desires themselves aren't inherently bad.
Right.
But the ways our personality tries to fulfill them can become self-limiting or sometimes even destructive. That's where the work lies.
It sounds like trying to quench a really deep thirst with, fizzy pop. It might feel good for a second, but it doesn't truly satisfy.
That's a good analogy. And our sources also touch on this really profound idea. humans as spiritual presences incarnated.
That really resonates with the Christian concept of the Imago Dei, right? Being created in God's image.
Exactly. And if you look at it through that lens, the Enneagram becomes a powerful tool for Christian growth because it helps us identify and maybe gently dismantle the ego structures, the personality patterns that obscure that original divine imprint.
Allowing us to live more fully into who God actually created us to be.
That's the goal, I think.
Okay, let's zoom in now on Type 8, the challenger. What's really driving them? What's their core motivation?
Fundamentally, for an 8, it boils down to a desire for control. And just as importantly, avoiding being controlled or harmed by others.
Okay, control.
Yeah, there's this deep-seated need for independence, for self-reliance, a real resistance to needing others.
Where does that come from?
Often it seems to stem from a fear of being vulnerable, of being weak, of being at someone else's mercy, or maybe being betrayed or manipulated if they let their guard down.
And this shows up in some pretty intense ways, I gather. The sources mention the passion of lust for 8s, but maybe not in the way we usually think of that word.
That's right. It's a specific Enneagram term here. For an 8, lust signifies this relentless drive for intensity, a need to push against limits, to exert their will, make an impact, feel alive through their own power.
So a constant need for expansion.
Yeah, self-extension, making their presence felt. It's also linked to why they're in the reactive group in the Enneagram. 8s tend to react strongly, outwardly. They express anger directly and often need a response from others to feel like the interaction is complete, like they've been heard.
So when an 8 isn't operating from their healthiest place, how does this desire for control and that reactivity play out, especially with anger?
Well, at what we call the average levels of development, this fear of losing control can make them seem quite confrontational, maybe even intimidating. They might use their natural assertiveness or even veiled threats as a way to maintain the upper hand. Because the underlying fear is that if they don't, they'll be the ones controlled or taken advantage of.
So the anger is direct.
Very direct, usually. And it can be used, consciously or not, as a tool to get others to back down, to yield.
And what happens if they feel even more threatened, more insecure?
Well, that's when the intensity dial gets cranked way up. They tend to become even tougher, more aggressive. They can feel completely justified in taking a really hard line.
Like the world's a battlefield.
Sort of, yeah. They might see the world as a tough place where only the strong survive, and they feel they have to be the strongest. And alongside this, there can be a real denial of their own vulnerability, their softer emotions.
Trying to handle everything alone.
Absolutely. Trying to handle it all themselves, often pushing themselves way too hard, leading to overwork, exhaustion.
That sounds like a huge amount of internal pressure. How does actual conflict trigger those deeper fears for an 8?
Conflict situations can really poke at the heart of an 8's core fears. Anything where they perceive a threat to their autonomy, where they feel someone is trying to control them, maybe defy their authority or take advantage, that can instantly trigger their defenses.
And out comes the anger?
Often, yes. Even things that might seem like subtle disrespect or resistance to others can be interpreted by an 8 as a direct challenge to their power, their control. And that can lead to a very strong, sometimes seemingly disproportionate reaction.
So it's not always about the big, obvious power struggles. It can be small things.
It really can. They can be incredibly sensitive to any perceived slight to their self-respect or their sense of being in charge, even while they're projecting this image of being completely impervious, untouchable.
So the anger, forceful as it is often a shield.
Very much so.
Yeah.
It's often protecting those underlying fears of being hurt, being vulnerable, being controlled. Understanding that link is just fundamental if you want to understand anger for type 8s and how to work with it constructively.
Okay. Now, let's talk about these paths you mentioned earlier, integration and disintegration. What do those concepts mean generally across the Enneagram types?
Okay, so think of the levels of development within each of the 9 types. It's like a spectrum, right? Ranging from really healthy, balanced expressions of that type's core gifts, all the way down to unhealthy, highly reactive patterns.
And we move along that spectrum.
We all move up and down within our own type's spectrum. Yeah, that's sometimes called our bandwidth. Now, the direction of disintegration, that describes what tends to happen when we're under significant stress.
We fall apart.
Not exactly fall apart, but we tend to unconsciously take on the less healthy characteristics of another specific Enneagram type. It's like a coping mechanism kicks in.
A different type's unhealthy stuff.
Yeah, It's often an unconscious survival strategy. It might give some temporary relief, maybe a different way to deal with the pressure, but it
Yeah.
doesn't actually solve the root problem. It's not growth.
Okay, so that's disintegration. What about integration? That sounds more positive.
It is. The direction of integration is the path towards growth, towards healing. As we start to become more self-aware, heal some of our core wounds, and let go of the limitations of our type's patterns. We naturally start to embody the healthier qualities of another specific type. That type represents qualities we need to integrate for our own wholeness.
And this happens more easily when we're doing better overall.
Generally, yes. Accessing those positive qualities of our integration type becomes more possible as we operate from the healthier levels within our own basic type.
So when we're disintegrating, it's like we're borrowing unhealthy coping mechanisms from elsewhere.
That's a really good way to think about it. And it burns energy, right?
Yeah.
Because you're not dealing with the real issue. You're just sort of acting out in a different, unhelpful way.
And it could even make it hard to know your own type.
Absolutely. During really stressful periods, someone might look a lot like their disintegration type and mistakenly identify with it rather than their core type.
Whereas integration is about letting go.
It's about letting go of some of that personality baggage, yeah. Which then makes those needed positive qualities, the gifts of the integration type, more naturally available to us. It feels less like effort and more like uncovering something already there.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, bringing it back specifically to type 8 now. How might their past, their history, shape them towards this type? And what are those common triggers in conflict situations?
Well, the Enneagram isn't strictly deterministic. It doesn't say this event causes this type. But we can see patterns. Certain kinds of early experiences might, let's say, encourage the development of type 8 tendencies.
Like what, for example?
For instance, growing up in an environment where you felt you had to be strong, maybe to protect yourself or others, where vulnerability was seen as weakness or even punished.
So you learn early on, don't show weakness.
Exactly. You learn to put up a tough exterior, maybe cut off from softer feelings, because showing them feels dangerous, like it opens you up to being hurt or exploited.
What about feeling unheard?
That too. If a child consistently felt powerless, like their voice didn't matter or they couldn't influence things, they might develop this really strong determination as an adult to always assert themselves, to never let anyone control them again.
Okay. And when these deeply ingrained patterns meet conflict later in life, what lights the fuse?
Conflict tends to strike right at that core. 8 fear. Being controlled, being harmed, being betrayed. So anything that feels like disrespect or a challenge to their authority or like someone's trying to take advantage or manipulate them, that can immediately set off internal alarm bells.
And trigger that strong, often angry response.
Yes. Even, as we said, seemingly small things. Minor acts of defiance, perceived resistance, anything that feel like it undermines their sense of being in charge or respected.
So it's not just about overt power struggles. The perception of being slighted is key.
Absolutely. They can be highly attuned to any hint that their autonomy or preeminence is being questioned, even while they're projecting that image of total invincibility.
Okay, let's look at those specific paths for type 8. When they're under significant pressure, what does that disintegration path typically look like for them?
Right. So when 8s are stressed and their usual methods of asserting control aren't working or feel too risky, they tend to move in their direction of disintegration, which is towards the unhealthy aspects of type 5, the investigator.
5. That seems quite different from 8.
It is. Instead of their usual outward confrontational style, they might actually withdraw, become more secretive, more isolated.
Pulling back instead of pushing forward.
Exactly. They start trying to process things internally, almost hoarding information or energy. They can become more detached, observational, less willing to engage directly with whatever is causing the stress.
And emotionally.
You might see more cynicism emerge, maybe even a degree of paranoia. It's like they retreat into their minds as a way to cope with feeling overwhelmed or threatened, trying to figure things out intellectually from a distance. It's a less effective way for them to try and regain control when their usual assertive strategies feel blocked.
Okay, that's the stress path. What about the growth path? Integration. Where do healthy, growing 8s tend to move towards?
As 8s start to loosen that tight grip on needing constant control, as they become willing to lower their defenses against vulnerability, they begin moving towards the healthier qualities of type 2, the helper.
Towards 2. So towards connection and care.
Precisely. They start to get in touch with their own capacity for tenderness, maybe acknowledging their own past hurts and vulnerabilities. This helps them understand why they built those protective walls so high in the first place.
That sounds like a really significant shift, a softening.
It really is. And with that comes the realization of how genuinely good it can feel to care for people, to support them, to do good things for them. There's a joy and connection that opens up.
But it's not about becoming like an unhealthy mood host.
Yeah.
Right. Not people-pleasing or being manipulative.
Absolutely not. That's a key distinction. It's about accessing the healthy two qualities. Genuine empathy, heartfelt compassion, the ability to truly open their hearts to others without expecting something back or trying to control through giving. It's about letting those gentler feelings, which they often keep locked down, actually emerge and be expressed.
And how does moving towards 2 help with the anger issues we talked about?
This integration path is absolutely vital for healthier anger management for 8s, as they become less driven purely by fear and the need to dominate or control, and more connected to their own vulnerability and their capacity for care and empathy. Their reactions naturally become less volatile, less explosive.
So less reactive, more responsive.
Exactly. They start responding to situations from a place of grounded strength and compassion rather than just reacting defensively from that place of underlying fear. Embracing what some writers call their innate bigness of heart requires real courage, though.
Courage to be vulnerable.
Yes, and courage to trust something beyond their own power, their own will. It means consciously choosing to let go of those defenses sometimes.
Our sources also mention counseling being helpful here.
Yes, definitely. Therapy or counseling can provide a really safe container for 8s to explore these deep-seated patterns, to gently unpack the fears around vulnerability without feeling threatened. It can really support that shift from relying solely on their own strength to embracing a healthier connection and interdependence.
And for 8s on a path of Christian growth, there was a mention of aligning with divine will. How does that fit?
Well, it connects directly to letting go of that ego-driven need for absolute control. For an 8 integrating within a Christian framework, it often involves this conscious shift away from pure self-will or willfulness towards seeking alignment with what they perceive as God's will, God's purpose.
So channeling their strength differently?
Exactly. Their natural leadership qualities, their immense strength and energy can then be channeled into something incredibly positive, inspiring others, protecting the vulnerable, championing justice, leading from a place of service rather than dominance. It's moving from that me against the world stance to seeing themselves as using their God-given strength as part of a larger divine purpose. It means learning to rely not just on their own considerable power, but also on God's strength, God's love. And that naturally fosters greater compassion and a desire to serve.
So just to kind of wrap up our deep dive into Type 8 today, we've really seen how the Enneagram can offer this rich framework, not just for self-understanding, but specifically for spiritual growth within a Christian context. And understanding those core motivations, those deep fears of Type 8, is just so crucial for getting a handle on their anger, both for 8s themselves and for those relating to them.
Absolutely. And we looked at those contrasting dynamics, disintegration, that stress reaction, pulling them towards unhealthy, 5 traits like withdrawal.
And integration, the growth path towards healthy. 2, embracing vulnerability, care, and compassion.
Right. We also touched on how past experiences might shape an 8 and what typically triggers their strong reactions in conflict, usually perceived threats to their control or respect.
And finally, we explored how that integration towards 2, sometimes supported by things like counseling and a conscious choice to align with divine purpose, really offers a way forward for healthier anger management and, well, just a more whole and fulfilling life for the 8.
Yeah. And perhaps, as a final thought for you listening, take a moment to consider which aspects of your own personality, whatever your Enneagram type might be, could be creating some obstacles. Obstacles to a deeper connection with yourself, perhaps, or with God. And think about those principles of integration we discussed. What qualities, maybe it is vulnerability for you, or maybe it's assertiveness, or maybe it's learning detachment. What qualities might integrating offer you a path towards greater wholeness, towards more peace on your own journey?
Something to definitely reflect on. The Enneagram, it seems, when you approach it with that openness and a real desire for growth, can be a pretty profound tool.
It really can. For ongoing self-discovery and definitely for deepening that connection to the spiritual side of our lives.